The irony wasn't lost on me that I discovered my husband had read every single cruel message I'd sent about him while sitting in a Starbucks, surrounded by happy couples sharing overpriced lattes. My phone buzzed with a text from Colin. "We need to talk when you get home." I know about the messages. My stomach plummeted straight through the floor. After 2 years of marriage and 4 years together, I'd finally been caught. I'm Jolene, and at 31, I thought I had mastered the art of compartmentalizing my life. There was work Jolene, who managed marketing campaigns for a small but successful consulting firm. Wife Jolene, who meal prepped on Sundays and remembered to water the plants. And friend Jolene, who still hung out with the same crew from graduate school like we were all still 25 and figuring life out over cheap wine and questionable decisions. The problem was, these versions of myself had started bleeding into each other in ways that would ultimately cost me everything. Colin and I met at a mutual friend's housewarming party in 2019. He was the quiet guy in the corner who turned out to be wickedly funny once you got him talking. A financial advisor with steady income, reliable car payments, and the kind of emotional stability that made my chaotic dating history look like a reality show audition reel. When he proposed on our second anniversary at the same spot we'd first kissed, I said yes before he finished the question. My graduate school friends, Bryce, Ian, and Ramai, had been fixtures in my life for nearly a decade. We'd survived comprehensive exams, thesis defenses, and the brutal job market together. They were like family, the kind of bonds forged through late-night study sessions and shared academic trauma. When Colin came into the picture, I assumed he'd blend seamlessly into our established dynamic. That assumption was my first mistake. Initially, Colin tried to be the cool husband. He'd join us for trivia nights at our usual dive bar, laugh politely at inside jokes from our graduate program, and pretend not to notice when Bryce got a little too touchy after his third beer. But I started sensing tension in the small spaces between words, how Colin would go quiet when Ian texted me during dinner, or the way his jaw would tighten when Ramai called me by the nickname he'd coined during our second year, Trouble. The real problems began about 8 months into our marriage. I'd gotten promoted to senior marketing manager, which meant longer hours, bigger projects, and more stress. Naturally, I turned to my tried and true coping mechanism, venting sessions with the guys. What started as innocent complaints about deadlines gradually evolved into detailed discussions about my personal life, including my marriage. Colin's being weird about us hanging out again, I'd say during our Thursday happy hours. He keeps asking why we need to meet every week. Because we've been meeting every week for 8 years. Ian would respond, always ready with the validation I was seeking. Exactly. Some people don't understand friendship loyalty, Ramai would add, shooting me that knowing look that made me feel like the reasonable one in my marriage. These conversations felt harmless at the time. They were my friends, my support system. If I couldn't talk to them about my life, who could I talk to? The answer, obviously, was my husband. But that would have required acknowledging that maybe some of his concerns weren't completely unreasonable. The Thursday sessions gradually expanded into a group text thread Bryce created called Jolene's Council of Advisors. It started innocently enough, sharing memes, coordinating plans, general life updates. But slowly, it became my primary outlet for marital frustration. When Colin suggested we spend a weekend at his parents' lake house instead of going to Ian's birthday party, I screenshot his text to the group with the caption, "Guess who's trying to isolate me from my friends now?" When he mentioned feeling uncomfortable with how often Ramai texted me late at night, I shared that conversation too. Colin's having trust issues again. Someone reassure me that having male friends isn't a crime. The guys were always ready with supportive responses that confirmed what I wanted to hear, that Colin was being possessive, that I had every right to maintain my friendships, that his discomfort was his problem to solve. Looking back, I can see how they were feeding into something toxic. But at the time, their constant validation felt like proof that I was in the right. The messages grew increasingly mean-spirited as Colin's concerns became more vocal. When he asked if we could establish some boundaries around my friendships, maybe not texting with the guys after 10 p.m. or spending one weekend a month, just the two of us, I presented his request to the group as evidence of his controlling nature. "Who does he think he is, setting rules about my friendships?" I typed after a particularly heated discussion. "Next he'll be choosing your outfits," Bryce responded. "Classic insecurity behavior," added Ian. That's when I started calling him names. Nothing too harsh at first, just little digs that felt satisfying to type and even better to share. When Colin got upset about me canceling our dinner plans to help Ramai with his job interview preparation, I messaged the group. "Colin's throwing another tantrum about you guys. Sometimes I think I married the biggest drama queen in the state." The turning point came during what should have been a romantic anniversary dinner. Colin had made reservations at the restaurant where we'd had our first official date, complete with a request for the same corner table. He'd even worn the navy shirt I'd complimented on him countless times. But halfway through our appetizers, my phone started buzzing with messages from the group chat. Ian was having a crisis about a job interview, and the guys were all weighing in with advice. I couldn't resist checking the messages, laughing at Bryce's joke about Ian's tendency to overthink everything. When Colin gently asked if I could put my phone away for our anniversary dinner, I felt a flash of irritation that he was trying to control my availability to my friends. Without thinking, I snapped a photo of his disappointed face and sent it to the group with the message, "Anniversary dinner police reporting for duty." The response was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. "Oof, someone's feeling neglected," Ramai wrote back. "Tell him to book a therapy session if he needs undivided attention," added Bryce. But for the first time, something about their responses felt wrong. Sitting across from my husband, who had clearly put effort into making our anniversary special, I felt a twinge of shame about turning his vulnerability into entertainment for my friends. I quickly put my phone away and tried to salvage the evening, but the damage was done. Colin had seen me take the photo, and something shifted in his expression. He became polite, distant, going through the motions of anniversary conversation while clearly processing what had just happened. When we got home, he went straight to bed without our usual recap of the evening. I told myself he was overreacting, but deep down, I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The incident should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it became a template. Anytime Colin expressed hurt or disappointment about my behavior, I found myself instinctively reaching for my phone to document his unreasonable reactions. His attempt to discuss our communication patterns became Colin's giving me a lecture about my texting habits. His suggestion that we spend more quality time together became apparently I'm not entertaining enough company for my own husband. Each screenshot felt like evidence that I was the victim in our relationship, proof that Colin was demanding and controlling rather than simply trying to connect with his wife. The guys' responses reinforced this narrative so consistently that I stopped questioning whether my perspective might be skewed. They became my reality check, my validation that Colin's expectations were unreasonable and his hurt feelings were manipulative rather than genuine. What I didn't recognize at the time was how the constant documentation was changing the way I experienced my marriage. Instead of being present during difficult conversations with Colin, I was mentally composing captions for the group chat. Instead of listening to understand his perspective, I was listening for material that would make the guys laugh. I had turned my husband into content and our marriage into a performance piece for an audience that had never invested in our success. The group chat had become my primary relationship, with Colin relegated to supporting character in my own life story. I was more invested in maintaining my image as the cool, independent wife who wouldn't be controlled than I was in actually nurturing the partnership I'd promised to prioritize. Every message I sent mocking Colin's attempts to communicate was a small betrayal that added up to something much larger and more devastating than I could have imagined. The guys loved it. They started adding their own commentary, creating elaborate scenarios about Colin's supposed jealousy, and worst of all, encouraging me to document more of our private conversations. "You should write a book about life with Mr. Insecurity," Ramai suggested after I shared Colin's attempt to discuss his feelings about our friendship. That's when I crossed the line I didn't even know existed. After Colin asked me to please consider his perspective about feeling excluded from my inner circle, I screenshot our entire text conversation and sent it to the group with the message. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my husband, the circus performer who specializes in overreacting." What a clown. The response was immediate and encouraging. Bryce changed our group chat name to Jolene and the Clown Show. Ian started sending circus-themed gifs. Ramai created an elaborate meme comparing Colin to various circus performers, each more insulting than the last. I was so caught up in the validation and laughter that I completely lost sight of what I was actually doing, systematically destroying my husband's dignity and our marriage's privacy for the entertainment of 3 men who had never liked him to begin with. For weeks, this became our routine. Colin would express concern or try to initiate a serious conversation about our relationship, and I'd immediately run to the group chat for backup. They'd provide the exact response I was looking for, that he was overreacting, being controlling, failing to trust me, and I'd return to our conversation armed with their talking points instead of my own authentic thoughts. "Bryce thinks you're projecting your trust issues," I'd tell Colin during arguments, as if citing my friend as a relationship expert somehow proved my point. "Ian says most secure men don't feel threatened by their wife's friendships," I'd add, watching Colin's face fall as he realized our private discussions weren't actually private at all. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but how good it felt. Every message I sent mocking Colin's concerns was met with immediate validation. Every screenshot I shared of his attempts to communicate was treated like comedy gold. I felt funny, supported, and most importantly, right about everything. I was so addicted to their approval that I stopped seeing Colin as my partner and started viewing him as content for the group chat. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd woken up early to prep for a big presentation, and Colin was making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly to himself. It was one of those small, sweet moments that usually made me appreciate our quiet life together. Instead, I found myself annoyed by his contentment. How dare he be happy when I had a stressful day ahead? When he offered to make me breakfast, I snapped at him about being late for work. When he suggested we grab dinner together that evening, I told him I already had plans with the guys. "We haven't had a night just the 2 of us in almost 3 weeks," he said quietly. "We live together, Colin. We see each other every day." "That's not the same thing, and you know it." I was already typing in the group chat before he finished the sentence. "Colin's having another episode about us not spending enough quality time together, as if sitting on our couch watching Netflix counts as a romantic evening." The guys' responses were swift and predictable. But for the first time, something felt off about the whole dynamic. Maybe it was the dejected look on Colin's face, or the fact that he'd stopped trying to argue with me altogether. He just nodded, finished his coffee, and left for work without his usual goodbye kiss. That evening, instead of meeting the guys, I found myself driving home early, planning to surprise Colin with his favorite takeout and maybe an apology. But when I walked through the door, he was sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open, wearing an expression I'd never seen before. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his tone made my chest tighten. That's when he told me about the messages. All of them. Apparently, our shared cloud storage had been backing up my deleted messages for months. Every cruel joke, every screenshot of his private texts, every time I'd called him names or mocked his feelings, it had all been automatically saved to our family account. "I've been reading them for weeks," he said, his voice eerily calm. "At first I thought it was some kind of mistake. Then I realized this is what you actually think of me. This is how you talk about our marriage when I'm not around." I stood there in our kitchen, still holding the bag of his favorite Thai food, trying to formulate an explanation that might make sense. But what could I possibly say? That I didn't mean it, that I was just venting. That the guys had encouraged the behavior so it wasn't entirely my fault. All of those things were true, but they were also completely beside the point. "I called you a clown," I whispered, the reality of my actions finally hitting me. "You called me a lot of things." But that wasn't the worst part. He turned the laptop toward me, showing months of messages displayed in chronological order. "The worst part is that you turned our marriage into entertainment for 3 guys who have never respected our relationship. You gave them our most private moments to laugh at." Looking at the messages in context, removed from the group chat's encouraging atmosphere, was like seeing my behavior through a stranger's eyes. The person who had written those words was cruel, petty, and completely indifferent to her husband's feelings. The person who had shared intimate details of their marriage for cheap laughs was someone I didn't want to recognize as myself. "Colin, I've been trying to figure out when you stopped seeing me as your partner and started seeing me as the villain in your story," he continued. "Was it before or after you decided that 3 men you've been friends with since graduate school were better authorities on our marriage than I am?" I wanted to argue with him, to explain the context he was missing, to somehow make him understand that it wasn't as bad as it looked. But sitting there, surrounded by evidence of my own cruelty, I realized that it was exactly as bad as it looked. Maybe worse. "They're my friends," I said weakly. "They're not your friends, Jolene. Friends don't encourage you to disrespect your husband. Friends don't cheer when you share private conversations without consent. Friends don't help you tear down your marriage for their own entertainment." He was right, of course, but admitting that would mean acknowledging that I'd been wrong about everything for months. It would mean accepting that the support system I'd relied on was actually undermining the most important relationship in my life. "I was just venting," I said, grasping for any justification. "Venting would be telling them you were frustrated. This," he gestured toward the laptop, "was character assassination. You turned me into a cartoon villain and invited them to laugh at my expense." The following days were a blur of uncomfortable realizations. Colin moved into our guest room while we figured things out, though it quickly became clear that he'd already figured everything out. He was done. I tried reaching out to Bryce, Ian, and Ramai, expecting the same supportive responses I'd grown accustomed to. Instead, I found 3 men who suddenly seemed very interested in distancing themselves from the situation they'd helped create. "I never meant for things to go this far," Bryce texted when I asked for advice about fixing my marriage. "Maybe you should talk to a counselor instead of us," Ian suggested, as if he hadn't been encouraging my behavior for months. Ramai was the most honest. "I think we all got carried away. Colin seems like a good guy, and maybe we weren't the best influences on your marriage." Just like that, my support system evaporated. The 3 men who had spent months validating my complaints about Colin's controlling behavior suddenly developed consciences once the consequences became real. I tried couples counseling, but Colin had already checked out emotionally. He went through the motions for 3 sessions before admitting that reading months of messages mocking his attempts to communicate had damaged something he didn't think could be repaired. "It's not just about the group chat," he explained during what turned out to be our final session. "It's about discovering that the person I married doesn't actually respect me enough to keep our problems private. How do I trust someone who thought our relationship was a joke worth sharing?" I wanted to argue that it wasn't like that I'd just gotten carried away, that I'd learned my lesson. But the evidence was overwhelming. I had treated our marriage like a reality show and my husband like a character I could mock for other people's amusement. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Colin was fair about everything, more than fair, considering what I'd put him through. He took his half of our assets, found a new place across town, and began the process of rebuilding his life without me. I kept the house we'd bought together, but it felt hollow without Colin's quiet presence filling the spaces between rooms. The guys and I tried to resume our old dynamic, but something fundamental had shifted. Without Colin to collectively complain about, we discovered we didn't actually have that much in common anymore. Bryce started dating someone seriously and became less available for our regular gatherings. Ian took a job in another city and moved away without much fanfare. Ramai and I still text occasionally, but our conversations feel stilted now, weighted with the knowledge of what our friendship had ultimately cost me. The hardest part isn't losing Colin, though that's devastating enough. The hardest part is realizing that I destroyed something good because I was addicted to being right, to being validated, to being the star of my own victim narrative. I convinced myself that Colin's reasonable requests for boundaries were evidence of his controlling nature. I turned his attempts to communicate into comedy material. I prioritized the approval of 3 men who barely knew him over the feelings of the man I'd promised to love and honor. Looking back, I can see exactly when things started going wrong. It wasn't when Colin expressed concerns about my friendships. Those concerns were actually pretty reasonable. It was when I decided that his discomfort was something to be mocked rather than addressed, when I chose to seek validation from people who had never invested in my marriage instead of working through problems with the person who had. I spent months convincing myself that I was the victim of Colin's insecurity, when really I was the architect of our relationship's destruction. I called him a clown for overreacting, but I was the one performing for an audience instead of participating in my own marriage. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I ran into Colin at a grocery store. He looked good, rested, maybe even happy. We made awkward small talk about work and the weather, carefully avoiding any mention of what had happened between us. As we parted ways, he said something that stayed with me. "I hope you're doing well, Jolene." I really mean that. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just genuine concern for someone he'd once loved enough to marry. It was more grace than I deserved, and it made me realize how completely I'd wasted something precious. These days, I'm more careful about who I trust with my private thoughts. I'm working with a therapist to understand why I was so desperate for external validation that I was willing to sacrifice my marriage for it. I'm learning to sit with discomfort instead of immediately seeking relief through other people's opinions. I still think about Colin sometimes, wondering if he's found someone who appreciates his quiet steadiness, his attempts to communicate openly, his basic human need to be treated with respect by his partner. I hope he has. He deserves someone who sees his concerns as valid rather than comedic, who treats their relationship as sacred rather than as material for group entertainment. I called him a clown for overreacting about my guy friends. Turns out the only person performing was me, and the show cost me everything that mattered. The real punchline. I was never actually happy in those moments when I was mocking Colin for the group chat's amusement. I was just addicted to the temporary high of being agreed with, being told I was right, being the center of attention in my own life drama. I traded a genuine partnership with someone who loved me for the shallow validation of people who were ultimately just entertained by my misery. Now I understand what Colin meant when he said I'd stopped seeing him as my partner. Somewhere along the way, I'd started seeing him as an obstacle to my friendships rather than as the person I'd chosen to build a life with. I'd prioritized being right over being married, being validated over being honest, being entertained over being loving. It's taken me a long time to admit this, but Colin wasn't overreacting. He was trying to save our marriage from people who were actively undermining it, including me. He saw what I refused to see, that my relationships with Bryce, Ian, and Ramai had become toxic to my marriage, not because male friendships are inherently problematic, but because I was using those friendships to avoid dealing with problems in my marriage. I thought I was being loyal to my friends by defending them against Colin's concerns. Really, I was being disloyal to my husband by refusing to consider that maybe, just maybe, he had a point. The saddest part is that it didn't have to end this way. If I'd been willing to listen to Colin's concerns instead of immediately dismissing them, if I'd prioritized our marriage over my need to be right, if I'd treated him with the same respect I demanded from him, we might have worked through our problems together. Instead, I turned him into the punchline of jokes he never consented to be part of and lost the best relationship I've ever had in the process. I called him a clown, but the joke was on me.